Tonight, we're going back to a time when eating wasn't a pleasure, but a risk, a necessity, a quiet act of survival. Forget the roasted meats, the warm loaves of bread, the comforting soups and stews that fill your home with the smell of security. In medieval Europe, for most people, food didn't taste good. It didn't nourish the soul. It barely fed the body. And sometimes it killed you. This isn't a horror story. This is dinner around the year 1347. Before we begin, thank you for being here. It means a lot that you've chosen to spend part of your evening with me, exploring these slow, strange corners of history. If you're enjoying this journey, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, give the video a like, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and what city you're rewatching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, imagine this. You've just finished 12 hours of labor. Maybe you've been hauling stones for a new wall, or repairing thatched roofs, or tending to muddy fields. Your muscles are sore. Your fingers are cracked. Your back is stiff. Your stomach is empty, loud, and demanding. And what's waiting for you at home? Not a meal, in any comforting sense. Just a bowl. Inside, a thick, grayish paste, lukewarm, unseasoned, and lumpy. It might contain some barley, a wilted cabbage leaf, a sliver of onion, a bone, if someone was feeling generous. It smells faintly of boiled earth and smoke. This isn't an accident. It's not the result of a bad cook or a ruined recipe. This is normal. This is dinner for a medieval peasant. There was no joy in eating, no rituals of taste, no moment of relief. Food was a calculation, how to get just enough into your body to make it through another day without passing out, getting sick, or losing your teeth. Because yes, even the bread was a hazard. Bread in the Middle Ages was nothing like the soft, golden loaves we imagine today. It was coarse, dense, and often full of grit. That's because the grain was ground in large stone mills, which shed tiny fragments of rock into the flour. Over time, every bite worked like sandpaper against your teeth. People's molars were worn down flat. Chewing became painful. And still, you kept eating. Sometimes the bread was stretched, not with more flour, but with filler. Powdered beans, old dried peas, sometimes even sawdust. Bakers who couldn't afford quality ingredients, or who simply wanted to increase profit, added what they could to bulk out their supply. And because there was no regulation, no packaging, no list of ingredients, you had no idea what you were biting into. Still, bread was essential. For many, it was the only thing they had. It was soaked in ale or pottage to soften it. It was shared between children in scraps. It was traded like currency when things got truly desperate. And if you're wondering why they didn't just drink water, they couldn't. Medieval water sources were rarely clean. Rivers were polluted. Wells often contaminated with human or animal waste. So instead, people drank ale. Not the kind of ale we think of today. Not strong, not tasty, and certainly not refreshing. It was weak, barely fermented, sometimes sour, and often tasted more like the wooden barrel it came from than any actual grain. But it was safer than water. Even children drank it because the alternative was worse. Imagine being a mother in this time. You've got 5 mouths to feed, and a cupboard that holds a dried onion, half a cabbage, and a few handfuls of oats. That's it. That has to last you 3 days. So you boil it. Add water to stretch it. Stir it with what's left of your wooden spoon, and hope that the pot doesn't burn. There's no meat, no milk, no eggs, no spices. You might have a sprig of wild garlic or some bitter herbs found near the forest edge. But that's the extent of flavor. Creativity in this kitchen doesn't mean variety. It means desperation. How to make nothing feel like something. Fruit was a rare treat, not a daily snack. Cheese was only available if you owned a cow, and most didn't. Protein came mostly from beans and lentils when they were in season. In winter, those vanished too. And without refrigeration, even the best intentions fell apart quickly. Preserving food was a fragile science built on instinct and chance. You could try to salt your meat, smoke it, dry it over a fire. But if the meat spoiled, and often it did, you still might eat it. Because the hunger was worse than the risk. Food poisoning wasn't a possibility. It was part of life. Nobody understood bacteria, but they knew that sometimes food made you sick. Stomachs cramped, fever set in, people died. And it wasn't just the poor. Even the wealthy weren't safe. Yes, they had more variety, meats, spices, fruit, wine, but preservation was still medieval. There were no cold rooms, no ice houses for most, no way to stop time. Rich food rotted too, and when it did, servants simply scraped off the mold, added more seasoning, and sent it to the table anyway. Spices, so expensive they had to be locked in chests, weren't used to enhance flavor. They were used to hide it. Cloves, ginger, cinnamon, all used to mask the taste of meat that was starting to turn. Fish that had sat out too long. Stew that had boiled too many times. So why was food so consistently awful? Because everything in the medieval world made it hard for it to be otherwise. Bad roads meant trade was difficult. What your village produced was often all you had access to. Farming tools were primitive. Yields were low. Crops failed often, especially if the weather turned. And the weather always turned. In 1315, it rained so much that fields became mud. Crops drowned, grain rotted, animals starved, people followed. That year is remembered not because of a single storm, but because the hunger that followed stretched for years. Prices for food tripled. People ate the seed grain they were supposed to plant in the spring. Some boiled leather to soften it. Some gnawed on bark. And in the darkest corners of the darkest villages, there were whispers of something worse. It's hard to prove, but the fear alone tells you everything. Still, they endured. Somehow, they made it through. They saved what they could, shared when they had extra, passed down what little knowledge they had. How to recognize a good patch of soil, how to dry beans on the vine, how to stretch a meal with nothing but water and wild greens. Hunger became a familiar companion. It never truly left, but it didn't stop them either. So tonight, as you settle in, maybe with a blanket, maybe with a snack nearby, take a moment to consider what food once meant. Not flavor, not celebration, but endurance. And as you fall asleep warm and safe, remember that not too. Long ago, most people went to bed hungry, their stomachs full of watery broth, and their dreams filled with soft bread that didn't break their teeth. Sleep well, because tomorrow we'll follow the footsteps of a medieval peasant through one long, exhausting day, meal by meal, and see what survival looked like from the inside. It's still dark when the rooster crows. Not that anyone really needed a wake-up call. In the medieval village, people are already stirring, bodies shifting in the cold, reaching instinctively for warmth that isn't there. A man wakes on a straw mattress. There are no sheets, no pillow, just an itchy wool blanket and the slow ache of another hard day beginning. Smoke clings to the inside walls. It's the only thing that lingers from yesterday's fire. His stomach growls before his feet touch the floor. Breakfast is nothing new. A piece of bread, bent and dry, maybe a little moldy. It's left over from the day before, maybe 2 days before. He scrapes off what he can and hands a smaller piece to his youngest child, who holds it with both hands like it's something rare. There's also ale, flat and warm, stored in a wooden jug. Weak and sour, it doesn't offer any joy, but it's safer than water, and that's what matters. No eggs, no butter, no fruit, no porridge unless something was left from the night before. This isn't a feast, it's fuel, and it's barely enough. The tools wait by the door. A wooden hoe, A basket, an old leather pouch with a cold lump of yesterday's pottage wrapped in cloth. That's lunch. The children are already outside, gathering firewood and checking the hens. One of them cries out, they found a cracked egg. It's a lucky find, but too small to share, so it disappears quietly into a pocket. Outside, the mist hasn't lifted. He nods to a neighbor who's chewing on a strip of dried turnip like it's meat. No words are exchanged, just a nod of mutual understanding. The day has begun. They walk to the fields. The ground is rough. The sun rises slowly. The sky turns from gray to pale blue, but the warmth never truly comes. By mid-morning, his back aches. His hands are raw. The wind picks up, pushing dust into his mouth, into his eyes. He coughs and keeps digging. There's no stopping. Lunch is under a crooked tree. It's not a break. It's a pause. He unwraps the pouch. Cold pottage, thicker now. Made with cabbage, a few scraps of onion, a handful of oats. His fingers are too dirty to notice anymore. The spoon broke last week. He eats with his hands. Nearby, someone shares a sliver of cheese hard, crumbly, a little sour. It's a gift. Another man offers a slice of dried apple, tough and brown. It's chewed slowly, like it means something. There's no talking, just chewing and the quiet sound of wind through dry branches. He thinks of the harvest, the rumors of more taxes, the aching oxen that pulled the plow. It's a lot to carry, and the food doesn't help much. Afternoon stretches into fatigue. Every movement slows, but the work goes on. The sun begins to dip. Shadows stretch across the fields. The children are waiting at home. Evening means gathering wood, checking the grain store, chasing off a crow that's been hanging around the chicken coop. The fire is started again, carefully. It takes time. Dinner can't cook without it. And what is dinner? Another pot of pottage. Always pottage. It's what there is. It has thickened during the day and smells slightly better than it did the night before. The same vegetables. The same effort. A piece of bread is pulled from the shelf. It's hard as a brick. They dip it into the stew, trying to soften it. It barely helps. The children are quiet. They chew slowly. One of them asks for more. There is no more. A neighbor knocks. She offers a small onion in exchange for a bowl of stew. It's a good deal. The food is divided again. A crust is handed to the youngest. He sucks on it quietly until he falls asleep. The fire dies down. The pot is scraped clean by the family dog. He gets nothing else tonight. The family curls together near the warmth. There is no dessert, no tea, no final comfort. This was not a bad day. No one got sick. The pottage didn't burn. The bread didn't run out. The cow didn't wander. The grain wasn't spoiled. The children are alive. That's a good day. Tomorrow it might rain. A rat might get into the pantry. The Lord might demand labor. The hens might stop laying. But for tonight, there is sleep. Not full sleep, not sweet sleep, but enough. So as you lie in your bed, warm and fed, think of a family gathered around smoke and bread, making it through another day. Because in the Middle Ages, that was already everything. Sleep well. And next time, we'll follow the turning of the seasons and see what happened when the food began to run out. Late autumn in a medieval village doesn't arrive with golden leaves and quiet beauty. It arrives with tension. The air feels different, sharper, colder, more serious. The days shrink into brief gray hours. The sky seems lower. Even the animals behave differently, growing restless or strangely quiet. It's not the season itself that brings fear, but what follows. Everyone knows what's coming. Winter, and with it, scarcity. The kind of scarcity that doesn't just make life uncomfortable, but dangerous. In a world without supermarkets, refrigerators, or canned goods, the arrival of winter means one thing. You either preserved enough food or you didn't. And if you didn't, your options narrow quickly. All through late summer and autumn, the village moves with urgency. There is no such thing as extra food. There is only food you manage to keep from rotting. The process begins with harvest, and with it, a flurry of desperate creativity. Apples are sliced thin and hung from rafters to dry. Beans are left on their stalks until they rattle, then shelled and stored in baskets. Herbs, thyme, sage, rosemary are bundled and tied, strung like garlands along the ceiling, more functional than decorative. Every root, every leaf, every stalk that can be dried is. Anything that resists the air, that stores moisture, or ripens too fast, is either eaten immediately or transformed. The pantry isn't a place of comfort. It's a room of strategies, an archive of edible time where survival is suspended in slow decay. Meat, if you are fortunate enough to have it, is dealt with quickly and with great care. A slaughtered pig becomes a project that can stretch through winter, but only if everything goes well. The cuts are rubbed in salt if you've managed to get enough of it, and then hung above slow-burning fires to smoke. The smoke isn't there for flavor, not really. It's a kind of defense, coating the surface, drying the muscle, making the meat inhospitable to whatever would come to spoil it. Sausages, hams, strips of bacon, they hang from the ceiling beams, darkening over days, sometimes weeks. The fire below is tended constantly, not for warmth or cooking, but to preserve. There's no second chance. If the meat spoils, it's gone, and with it, your safety net for January, February, March. Salt is more valuable than gold, and in some places, it's traded more often. Inland villages might barter wool or grain for a few precious blocks of it, often traveling long distances just to secure enough. In coastal towns, salt fuels entire industries, especially fish. Herring and cod are caught, then layered in barrels of salt, pressed and packed until they're hard, preserved not for pleasure, but for endurance. The result is not delicious. It's often tough, chewy, and bland, but it's edible, and in the depths of winter, that's all that matters. Milk cannot be stored as it is, so it's churned into butter or made into cheese. Eggs, when available, are sometimes buried in ash or submerged in lime water. These are imperfect solutions, always unpredictable. But in a world where cold storage doesn't exist, unpredictability is still better than nothing. Even vegetables that store well, turnips, carrots, onions, are not safe. They are hidden in root cellars, buried in straw, wrapped in cloth, rotated and checked daily. Any soft spot or strange smell is a threat. A single rotten turnip can destroy a barrel's worth. The winter larder is not just about storage, it's a system of faith and instinct. There is no thermometer, no expiration date, no sterile environment. There is only the peasant's eye, his nose, his memory of what worked last year. Families develop their own rhythms, their own tricks. One mother might know the perfect time to pull the cabbage before frost. Another might swear by a certain height for hanging beans. These aren't recipes, they're survival spells, passed down in whispers and rituals, changed slightly with each generation. Still, despite all this labor, there is no real security. Things go wrong. A cracked jar lets in moisture. A storm floods the pantry. A rat finds the flour sack and tells its friends. A barrel warps and leaks. A stretch of unseasonably warm weather causes spoilage in the cheese. When that happens, there is no backup plan. You eat it anyway. You scrape off the mold. You cut around the rot. You boil it a little longer and hope for the best. Because food doesn't get thrown away. Not here. Not when every bite is precious. And yet, even with full shelves and well-smoked meat, hunger still finds a way back in. Because the preservation is never perfect. By February, the pottage is thinner. By March, the root cellar is nearly empty. That's when the real test begins. It's called the hungry gap, a time when winter stores run out and spring has not yet begun to feed anyone. You are left with scraps, bones turned into broth, then boiled again, bread made from crushed acorns, soup flavored with dandelion leaves and whatever wild greens haven't frozen. Meals become smaller. Some disappear entirely. The children sleep more. The elderly speak less. And in the silence of the kitchen, there's an awareness that tomorrow might be worse. In bad years, people eat the seed grain, knowing it means nothing will grow in spring. They boil shoe leather. They chew bark. They dig for roots they barely recognize and hope they are not poisonous. Children are sent into the woods to look for berries or mushrooms, and sometimes they return triumphant. Sometimes they don't return at all. In these months, the line between food and not food begins to blur. And in the worst winters, that line is crossed completely. There are stories of people eating dogs, cats, even each other. Whether or not these tales are entirely true, they speak to a truth deeper than fact, the terror of emptiness, and the lengths to which people might go to quiet it. Still, people survived. Not all, but enough. The ones who lived became masters of adaptation. They learned to read the sky, to track the patterns of rain and frost, to notice which beans dried better, which cheeses molded slower, which herbs kept best in jars sealed with wax. They traded, bartered, whispered tips across fields and fences. They understood the world through hunger, and in that understanding, they became its most careful students. Winter taught them to be meticulous, to plan for the worst, and to never, ever waste. When spring finally arrived, it wasn't joyful. It was work. The soil was still hard, the air still cold. But planting began anyway, because the next countdown had already started. The shelves were bare. The hunger was real. And the only way forward was through labor. So tonight, as you lie in bed and listen to the hum of your refrigerator, think of those who had nothing but cold earth, wooden shelves, and the hope that drying and smoking and pickling might be enough. Think of the hands that tied bundles of time with string. Think of the fire that smoked the meat for 6 days straight. Think of the cellar, dark and quiet, holding just enough to get them through. Sleep well. And next time, we'll walk deeper into that pantry to see what happened when preservation failed and deception filled the gap between hunger and survival. Imagine a pantry not like the one you know, now filled with shelves of glass jars, packaged snacks, and cold drinks, but one carved out of stone or timbered dim and drafty, where the very idea of preservation is not convenience, but survival. In the medieval world, keeping food wasn't about shelf life, it was about staying alive. Every preserved bean, every salted fish, every dry apple was a promise, a fragile extension of life, measured not in months, but in heartbeats. This wasn't storage, it was defense against hunger, crafted with instinct, guesswork, and an unspoken prayer that it would be enough. As late summer settled in, and the final beans dried in their pods, panic crept into the edges of the harvest season. The fields were still full, yes, but everyone knew the moment was fleeting. Abundance was deceptive. Winter was waiting. So the village moved quickly. Apples were sliced into thin crescents and laid on cloth near windows or hung on cords in warm lofts. Over time, their skin shriveled and browned. What once promised sweetness now offered texture, density, and most of all time. Beans were shelled, their hard cores gathered into cloth sacks. Onions were braided into long swinging ropes and hung from rafters like vegetal wind chimes. Herbs were tied tightly in bunches: sage, mint, rosemary, and suspended from wooden beams to dry in the rising heat of the kitchen hearth. It wasn't decoration. It was a quiet ritual of defense. Meat, that most precious and perishable of resources, required its own methods. When a pig was slaughtered, an event that happened rarely, and with great deliberation, nothing could be wasted. The carcass was divided, the fat rendered, the organs set aside, and the cuts hung to smoke. The smoking process could take days, with meat hung above smoldering fires, turning slowly darker, harder, infused with the sharp tang of ash and time. The fire beneath was watched like a child. It had to burn low but steady, enough to dry but not to cook. A misstep could spoil the entire effort. Even then, success wasn't guaranteed. Mold, moisture, or insects might undo everything. But without the smoke, the meat would be gone in a day. If you had salt, and that was a luxury, you used it like magic. Salt could draw out moisture, transforming fish or meat into dry, resilient slabs that might last weeks or months if luck held. Entire villages by the coast revolved around salting herring, drying cod, or trading inland for meat that needed preserving. Salt wasn't seasoning, it was security. In some places, it was currency. In others, it was worth killing for. Pickling was common too, though it didn't look like it does now. There were no glass jars or vinegar bottles. Vegetables were submerged in ale dregs, sour wine, or thick brine, and packed into clay crocks. Sometimes wax was poured over the top to seal the lid, sometimes animal fat. The results were unpredictable, sharp, pungent, often bubbling with strange smells, but usually safe. Not tasty, perhaps, but then again, taste wasn't the goal. The line between edible and inedible was constantly shifting. You ate what survived. Fermentation offered other strange blessings. It was how sourdough bread was started, not with yeast from a packet, but with a living blob of dough that bubbled and grew when fed with flour and thyme. It was how ale was made, how soft cheeses developed their layers of flavor, and how cabbage turned to sauerkraut. No one understood the science behind it. There were no microscopes, no knowledge of bacteria. But people had learned over generations that certain things happened when you left food in the right place for the right amount of time. A dough left too long might collapse. A ferment kept too cold might never start. It was a game of patience, faith, and intuition. Of course, even with every trick, food could and often did fail. A jar cracked. A wax seal broke. A warm week brought rot. A mouse chewed through a bag of dried beans and left contamination behind. Flies laid eggs. Mold spread silently. Entire shelves could vanish overnight, not into theft, but into ruin. And when that happened, there were no replacements. You couldn't buy more. You couldn't reorder. All you could do was eat what remained, stretch it further, or go without. So families learned to ration. It was an art, often heartbreaking. One strip of smoked meat for the whole family, divided evenly. A spoonful of beans per person. A dried plum cut in quarters. A slice of old bread soaked in broth to make it feel like more. The early months of winter might pass with relative comfort, but by February, the larder grew thin. By March, it echoed. The hungry gap began. This was the most dangerous part of the year, the stretch between the last stores of preserved food and the first shoots of spring crops. It was when desperation truly set in. Meals were reduced to hot water with herbs, pottage made from scraps, wild greens scavenged from forest edges, nettles, sorrel, dandelions, anything not yet frozen. If it could be boiled and swallowed, it became part of dinner. Children were sent out to gather. Elderly villagers offered advice. Old songs sometimes carried instructions hidden in verses, passed down like whispered recipes: where to dig for roots, when to avoid mushrooms, which flowers were poisonous. And through it all, the pantry remained, not full, not reassuring, but present. A place of knowledge, of habit, of fear. It was checked daily, its contents inventoried mentally, even obsessively. Every successful meal pulled something from it. Every mistake carried the risk of waste. Preservation wasn't just storage, it was storytelling. The pantry held the tale of the harvest, the gamble of winter, and the careful hope of spring. So tonight, as you walk past your fridge, maybe opening it without thought, maybe choosing between snacks you'll half eat and forget. Try to picture this other room, the medieval pantry. Cold, quiet, a clay jug sealed with wax, a string of onions hanging above the hearth, a single wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, a sack of beans guarded like treasure, and beside it, a woman running her hand across the rim of a crock, checking the seal, lifting the lid slowly, and hoping that, just for tonight, it hasn't spoiled. Sleep well, because next, we'll leave the safety of the pantry and step into a much darker corner of medieval food history, where meals stopped pretending and deception crept in through every crumb, cup, and bite. Imagine biting into a slice of bread, expecting something familiar, something dull but safe, and instead, it crumbles like chalk in your mouth. The texture is wrong. The taste is flat, or worse, sour. Something about it lingers on your tongue like grit. You don't spit it out. You finish it because you're hungry, and because bread isn't something you question. Bread is supposed to be simple, dependable, the staff of life. But in the Middle Ages, bread often lied. For most people, bread wasn't just part of the meal. It was the meal. Cheap, filling, and when made honestly, nutritious enough to sustain life when nothing else was available. But honest bread was harder to come by than you'd think. Flour itself was often unreliable. Grain was milled in large stone wheels, and small fragments of grit from those millstones ended up in the flour. Over time, this wore down teeth, left molars flat or cracked, and turned every bite into a quiet act of erosion. But even that wasn't the worst of it. To stretch their supplies or maximize profits, some millers and bakers began to mix in fillers. Ground beans were common. Bran, chaff, and husks too. But more troubling were the substances added not for nutrition, but illusion. Clay, chalk, ground bones, even sawdust. These made the bread heavier, especially when it was sold by weight, but they also made it harder to digest, less nourishing, and in some cases, mildly toxic. The poorest customers had no idea. There were no labels, no standards, no one to protect them. Bread became a gamble, sometimes safe, sometimes dangerous, always eaten with hope more than trust. Authorities occasionally tried to intervene. In cities like London, bakers were subject to laws regulating the size and price of bread. There were officials who weighed loaves and inspected markets. If a baker was caught cheating deliberately, underweighting a loaf or adulterating it, he might be fined or worse, pilloried in the town square. Public humiliation was meant to deter deception, but hunger often speaks louder than law. In periods of scarcity, when grain prices soared and desperation filled every alley, even honest bakers were tempted to cut corners. And customers, equally desperate, were in no position to refuse. Bread wasn't the only liar at the table. Ale so widely consumed it was practically water carried its own quiet risks. Brewed in homes and taverns, it was meant to be simple. Grain, water, yeast, time. But good ale required good ingredients and careful fermentation. In a time when yeast was mysterious and temperature uncontrollable, mistakes were frequent. And some of those mistakes were deadly. Brewers who lacked proper ingredients or knowledge often reused grain mash from previous batches, diluting it until the drink lost any real strength. Some skipped fermentation altogether, adding herbs or chemicals to simulate bitterness or foam. Others simply watered it down and hoped no one noticed. Sometimes these improvisations led to nothing worse than a sour taste. But other times they produced toxic brews filled with mold contamination or compounds that could cause hallucinations, sickness, even death. People drank it anyway, because the alternative was worse. Water was not safe. Wells were easily contaminated. Rivers carried waste from upstream. A clear stream could hide death in its currents. So ale, for all its flaws, remained the safest bet. Even if it tasted like old wood, even if it made you feel strange, even if you knew it had been cut or stretched or tampered with. You drank it. You gave it to your children. You hoped. And it wasn't just the ale. Milk could be thinned with water. Butter could be mixed with lard or starch. Cheese could be bulked with chalk or mashed legumes. What little meat was available was sometimes swapped entirely goat for mutton, dog for pork, even rat for rabbit. In cities, where anonymity protected vendors from recognition, these switches happened regularly. Street food especially became a carnival of uncertainty. A pie might contain mystery meat. A stew might include spoiled vegetables. A seller might promise lamb but deliver pigeon. The deception wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was survival. A vendor with nothing left to sell might add a handful of flour to extend his stew, or reuse broth too many times. He wasn't trying to harm. He was trying not to starve. But for the buyer, each transaction carried a question mark. You didn't just ask, "How much?" You asked silently, "Will this make me sick?" And often, the answer came only hours later, curled on a straw mat, holding your stomach, praying it would pass. Even the wealthier classes weren't immune. Their food looked more elaborate, more refined, but the same risks lurked beneath the gold-trimmed dishes. In noble kitchens, appearances mattered more than truth. A fish might be disguised as a bird, coated in pastry and feathers. A pie might be filled with live birds or painted in bright colors to impress guests. Underneath the spectacle, the ingredients were often the same, tired, stretched, and seasoned not for flavor, but for disguise. Almond milk was a common substitute during fast days, when animal products were forbidden by the church. But almonds were expensive, and cooks often faked the texture using breadcrumbs and oil. The resulting milk was thin, gritty, and entirely symbolic. It satisfied the rule, not the body. There was a strange theater to it all. The deception was built into the system. Food wasn't expected to be honest. It was expected to be convincing. In cities, people learned to test what they could smell in flour, watching how ale foamed, avoiding certain sellers, remembering who had made them sick last time. Word spread. Reputations mattered. But even vigilance couldn't catch everything. Stomach cramps were common. Fevers flared up. In some places, entire neighborhoods fell ill after a bad batch of bread or a spoiled cask of ale. Without medicine, without doctors, without understanding, these outbreaks could become deadly quickly. And yet, people continued. Because what choice did they have? They didn't expect perfection. They expected danger. Meals were approached with caution, not joy. A bowl of stew could nourish or kill. A loaf of bread could fill you or fail you. You chewed slowly, not to savor, but to assess. So tonight, as you reach for something in your fridge, confident in its label, secure in its ingredients, remember a world where trust was a luxury, where food could trick you, where every bite carried a risk, and every sip was a silent bet with your own body. Sleep well, because next time, we'll step inside the kitchens where all this was born, where smoke, ash, animals, and illness mixed freely, and cooking itself became a slow dance with danger. Imagine stepping into a kitchen, not the kind with tiles and sinks and drawers, but a shadowy space where smoke clings to everything and the smell of damp earth mixes with wood ash and old stew. The air is heavy. The walls are blackened. There's no counter, no refrigerator, no neat row of spices, just a central hearth, a pot hanging by a chain, and the constant threat of fire, rot, or vermin. This is where food begins in the Middle Ages. It is not clean. It is not safe. But it is essential. In most homes, especially those of peasants, a kitchen was not a separate room. It was the room. Everything happened here: sleeping, eating, cooking, mending, even birthing. The hearth was the heart, but it was also the hazard. Flames burned low most of the time because fuel was scarce. Smoke had nowhere to go, curling up into the rafters, seeping into walls, into blankets, into lungs. Chimneys were a luxury. At best, there was a small hole in the roof, and even that didn't always help. The floor? Dirt, hacked down by generations of feet, sometimes covered with rushes or straw, which were changed infrequently. Spills soaked in. Waste vanished into it. And into this space came the animals, chickens, goats, maybe a pig all, wandering freely, because pens were for those with land. Their droppings mixed with the mud, and the mud clung to everything. The same place you cooked was the place your child crawled, your shoes slept, your food fell. There was no running water. None for washing hands, none for rinsing vegetables, none for scrubbing a pot. Water came from a shared well or a nearby stream, often muddy, sometimes far. Buckets were reused. Soap existed, but it was rare and precious used for clothes, maybe not for cleaning hands. Hands were wiped on aprons, already stained, or on the sides of trousers, which hadn't been washed in weeks. Most food was stirred, touched, kneaded, and served by fingers that had just chopped wood or fed livestock. It wasn't negligence, it was normal. The tools were few. A large iron pot. A wooden spoon, if it hadn't cracked. A clay jug, maybe chipped. Plates, if they existed, were shared. Knives were dull, and children used them too. Storage? Whatever you could hang from the ceiling to keep it from rats. Bread, meat, herbs all dangled in the smoky air like prizes or temptations. If something spoiled, it was scraped, rinsed, or simply eaten anyway, because waste wasn't an option. Because hunger didn't care. The flies came, of course. With no screens, no sprays, they swarmed every open surface. They laid eggs in cheese, danced in ale, buzzed around stew. Sometimes you found larvae squirming in your food. You brushed them off. You stirred faster. The dog might lick the bowl when you finished. Not as a treat, but because he was hungry too, and it was the only cleaning the pot might get that day. And still this kitchen was the center of life. Here, stories were told. Here, birthdays were marked, and babies fed, and visitors received. There was pride in what little could be prepared. A stew that didn't burn. A loaf that didn't harden too quickly. A meal that filled, even if it didn't satisfy. Disease thrived in these kitchens. Food poisoning, dysentery, fevers with no name. When a child threw up or grew pale, people didn't blame bacteria. They didn't even know bacteria existed. They blamed bad air, a curse, an imbalance of humors. A stomach ache was dismissed. Vomiting was just a bad turn. You carried on. You hoped it passed. If it didn't, there wasn't much to be done. In towns, things weren't much better. Markets were loud and filthy. Butchers slaughtered animals on the spot, tossing guts into the gutter. Fish sellers scaled their catch on open tables, the refuse dripping into the street. The smell of rotting meat mixed with the stink of people, horses, waste, and smoke. But you shopped there anyway, because there was nowhere else. You picked the least brown cabbage. You sniffed the meat. You bartered for eggs. You prayed. In noble homes, things looked cleaner, but only on the surface. Kitchens might be larger, with more staff, better tools, a dedicated scullery. But understanding of hygiene didn't change with wealth. Servants still used their hands. Water was still carried in buckets. Food was still stored in cellars or hung from beams. The difference was in the polish, not the practice. Some cooks developed instincts. They learned which meat would turn first. They knew how sour was too sour. They salted aggressively. They added vinegar to disguise off smells. They used spices not just for flavor, but for masking decay. Ale that had gone flat became cooking liquid. Bread too stale to chew was crumbled into porridge. Pottage covered everything. There was wisdom here. Not scientific, but ancestral. Passed from mouth to mouth, from mother to daughter, from old woman to apprentice cook. It was not perfect. It could not stop illness, but it was something. And yet, for all its grime, this kitchen held warmth. It was where people gathered, where someone stirred the pot while recounting a story, where laughter echoed, even in hunger, where hands dirty and cracked still shaped food with love. It wasn't sterile, it wasn't healthy, but it was human. So tonight, as you stand in your kitchen, turning on a faucet, unwrapping something clean and labeled, think of the kitchens that came before. Think of the firelight, the smoke, the mud. Think of someone crouching by a pot, stirring, tasting, hoping, feeding a family with nothing but instinct, fire, and faith. Sleep well, because next time we'll step into the church's kitchen, where food was governed not by hunger or hygiene, but by faith, and where even a loaf of bread could become a matter of the soul. Imagine waking up hungry. Not the kind of hunger that comes from skipping lunch, but the quiet, deep kind that creeps in during the night and settles in your bones. You know there's meat in the house. A bit of salt pork, maybe left from last week's market day. But today, you won't eat it. Not because it has gone bad, or because someone else needs it more, but because the calendar says you can't eat. Welcome to the church's kitchen, where food was not only about survival, but about salvation. In medieval Europe, what you ate wasn't just a matter of taste or need, it was a reflection of your soul. The church didn't just guide your prayers or mark your holidays. It reached into your pantry, into your cookpot, into your dinner plate. Through a complex network of fasts, feast days, and forbidden foods, the church shaped the medieval diet with divine authority. This wasn't suggestion. It was law, backed not by soldiers, but by fear of eternal consequences. There were over 140 fast days on the calendar, more than 1/3 of the year. On those days, no meat, no dairy, no eggs, no animal fat, no cream, butter, off-limits, bacon, a sign. Even cooking with lard could put your soul at risk. And yet, fish strangely was allowed. The church, in its layered logic, classified fish as separate from flesh. They lived in water, not on land. They were clean in a spiritual sense, or at least distant enough from blood to pass divine scrutiny. And so, the markets near rivers and coasts flourished on fast days. The fish trade, already vital, became essential. This rule, of course, sparked creativity. People reclassified animals to fit the church's allowances. Beavers? They swam, didn't they? Must be fish? Puffins? They nested on cliffs near the sea. That counted. In some regions, otters were served with holy approval. The line between animal and acceptable blurred. But this wasn't just biology. It was faith wrapped in food, or food wrapped in faith. Lent was the most intense season of fasting. 40 days before Easter, entire communities shifted their habits. Markets emptied of meat. Butchers closed or hid their work. Meals grew plainer, thinner, quieter. Rich pies were replaced by watery soups. Even ale might be avoided. And while kings and nobles still ate better than peasants, even they were expected to observe the rules, at least in public. Monasteries set the tone. Monks lived under strict dietary codes, often eating only once or twice a day, in silence, with meals devoid of indulgence. Their food was nourishment, not enjoyment. Beans, leeks, stale bread, they became models of restraint. If a monk could live on cabbage, why not a merchant? If the holy could eat in silence, why not the common folk? And yet, where there are rules, there are loopholes. Wealthy households adapted. Their cooks became masters of substitution. Almond milk replaced dairy. Fish was sculpted into meat-like roasts. Eggs were faked from breadcrumbs and herbs. Fast-day cuisine was elaborate, inventive, exhausting. It followed the letter of the law while dancing around its spirit. A table filled with fish pies, spiced sauces, and gilded vegetables could still be technically pious, even if it felt like a feast. For the poor, fasting wasn't an act of devotion. It was just another name for hunger. Most peasants couldn't afford meat anyway. Fast days simply made their usual deprivation official. No bacon? No problem. There wasn't any to begin with. A meal of cabbage and oats wasn't piety. It was the only option. Still, they followed the rules. Because the church watched. Because the village watched. And because heaven, it was said, weighed even the smallest bites. Feast days balanced the scale, or tried to. Easter, Christmas, saints' days, on these holy days, abundance was encouraged. Meat flowed. Bread was baked fresh. Ale was poured in celebration. A sanctioned break from suffering. A moment of warmth and plenty. But even these came with warnings. Gluttony was a sin. So was drunkenness. So was pride in your feast. You could enjoy your meal, but not too much. Be grateful, not greedy. Full, but still humble. And behind all of this was meaning. Fasting wasn't just about control. It was about cleansing, about discipline. To abstain from food was to imitate Christ, to purify the body and spirit. A fast was a test. A bite could be a moral decision. The kitchen, a place of worship. The pantry, a battleground for the soul. Children learned these rules early. They memorized feast days and fast days, saints' names and liturgical calendars. They knew when to eat fish and when to skip cheese. Food was a kind of religious education, a map of belief. Even when famine struck, when bellies were empty regardless of doctrine, the church calendar remained. A fast day was still a fast day, even if all you had was soup made from weeds and prayer. Enforcement was real. Butchers caught selling meat on forbidden days faced fines, shame, sometimes worse. Bakers were watched. Markets were policed. Confession was required. Penance given. A meal eaten on the wrong day could cost you peace with God. And yet, people still broke the rules in secret, behind closed doors, with whispered justifications and hidden scraps. Because hunger is powerful. Because faith is complicated. Because human beings, even in piety, are still hungry. So tonight, as you choose your meal freely, without fear of sin or judgment, remember the kitchens where choice wasn't just about taste, but about theology. Where food was sacred and dangerous, comforting and conditional, where even a boiled onion could be holy or forbidden. Sleep well, because next time we'll step out of the cottages and cloisters and into the towering halls of nobility, where food wasn't just about survival or sin, but about spectacle, power, and pageantry. Step out of the muddy fields and away from the smoky cottage hearth. The air is cooler here, perfumed with herbs and candle wax. Your feet move across stone floors, not earth. You pass under archways and through wide wooden doors, and suddenly you are inside a great hall. It echoes with the clatter of silver goblets, the sound of harp strings, the soft hum of voices under candlelight. Welcome to the world of medieval nobility, where food was not just sustenance, it was spectacle, ceremony, and power served on a platter. To dine among the elite in the Middle Ages was to participate in a carefully choreographed performance. Every bite, every dish, every guest was part of a larger message. This is not just about feeding the body. It's about proving status, declaring wealth, solidifying alliances, and reminding everyone visibly, tangibly, that power begins at the table. The setting made that clear. Long wooden tables were draped with fine linens, embroidered cloths sometimes stitched with family crests. Candles flickered in iron chandeliers. Servants moved like shadows, refilling goblets, brushing crumbs from carved benches, watching for any sign of need before it was spoken aloud. At the head of the table, closest to the fire, sat the lord and lady of the house, dressed in furs and velvet, their hands adorned with rings. Their place was not just of honor, but of visibility. Everything in this hall revolved around their presence: the food, the music, the laughter, the order of the meal. The further down the table one sat, the simpler the food became. Hierarchy was not abandoned at the feast. It was reinforced with every course. And what courses they were! A single feast could have a dozen, sometimes 24 dishes. Not all at once, but in waves. First came light fare soups, soft breads, pickled vegetables. Then roast spore with spiced apples, venison in honey glaze, whole birds stuffed with herbs and almonds. Fish, pies, stews thick with cream, or crushed nuts followed. Trays were carved with delicacy, sauces poured with precision, pastries shaped into flowers or animals. These were not only meals, they were messages. A roast swan, its feathers reattached and wings spread wide, was not food. It was a declaration. Spices played a central role in this performance. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, each more expensive than the last, and all imported from lands so far that most had only heard of them in stories. These weren't added for subtle flavor. They were added to be noticed. A dish heavy with spice said something. I can afford to season this roast with the scent of distant empires. I have access to trade networks, to wealth, to merchants who bow when I enter. Spices were used generously, not just because they were exotic, but because they were rare. And rarity was prestige. The wine flowed freely imported, aged, poured into heavy cups that clinked with laughter and toasts. But even drinking followed rules. Etiquette mattered. 1 hand on the goblet. 2 sips, not 3. Speak only when addressed by someone of higher rank. The nobleman did not devour. He dined. He performed grace with each movement. He wiped his lips with cloth, not his sleeve. And still, behind this delicate pageantry, enormous amounts of food were consumed. A single feast could feed dozens of guests and still leave leftovers for dogs or servants. And the servants. These meals would not happen without them. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of workers filled the kitchens below the hall-turning spits over open flame, stirring pots as large as barrels, crushing spices with stone, trimming fat, plucking birds, baking loaves. Every task was part of a vast machinery of hospitality. Some specialized in carving meat, slicing it in precise shapes according to custom. Others were stewards, tasting food to check for poison. These kitchens were not just functional, they were strategic. Not all of this food was eaten. Much of it was wasted or given away to the poor, to the monastery, to the dogs. Sometimes it was saved, sometimes spoiled, sometimes sold. But its primary function had already been fulfilled the moment it appeared in the hall. It had made its point. The Lord is generous. The hall is full. The world is in order for tonight. And yet, this opulence existed in stark contrast to the hunger outside the castle walls. The peasant who smelled the roast from a distance would likely never taste it. The bread left uneaten at the end of the feast might be the richest food a beggar would ever hold. Scraps sometimes fed the poor, but more often they fed hounds or were discarded altogether. Still, for nobles, hosting a feast was more than indulgence. It was duty. A noble who shared his table in hard times earned loyalty. A lady who hosted a flawless banquet gained influence. Marriages were brokered over roasted lamb. Treaties signed after stewed pears and soft cheeses. These events were carefully controlled. The order of dishes, the order of seating, the number of courses, the timing of music, the pace of the procession, it was all ritual. The first toast was often to the church, the second to the king, then to guests of honor, then to allies. To break this order was more than impolite. It was dangerous. It suggested disorder, disrespect, weakness. In a world where reputation could mean the difference between safety and ruin, a meal was never just a meal. Even the spectacle served a purpose. Imagine a pie from which live birds flew when it was cut, their wings beating the air, feathers brushing the faces of surprised guests. Or a fish, shaped and dressed to look like a goose, with a golden beak and sugared feathers. These were not tricks. they were theater. They dazzled, they distracted. They reaffirmed that those who could dine like this belonged to a world above labor, above need. And behind all of it, beneath the velvets and silks and songs, was fear. The abundance was armor. The feast was a wall against doubt, because food, like power, could vanish. A poor harvest, a revolt, a war. The nobility knew that just as quickly as the bread rose, it could burn. So they performed wealth as protection. If the world saw their strength, it might not test it. Still, there was beauty in it. These moments of light and laughter in a dark, uncertain world. A knight returned from war. A bride walking through a hall lit by torches. A winter feast filled with song, with warmth, with full bellies and flushed cheeks. For a night, the world made sense. The fire was hot. The meat was tender. The cups were full. And in a time when life was short, when news traveled slow, and when hunger was just beyond the gate, those nights mattered. So tonight, as you snack on something simple in your quiet kitchen, imagine a feast that took days to prepare, that fed hundreds, that told stories with every bite. Imagine a roast peacock, its feathers shimmering in the candlelight. A goblet carved with dragons. A servant whispering the names of dishes as they're placed before you. This was noble dining, dramatic, excessive, deliberate. A banquet for the eyes, the tongue, and the soul. Sleep well, because tomorrow we follow something even more powerful than a noble's feast, something small, fragrant, and worth more than gold. The mysterious, dangerous luxury of medieval spices. Close your eyes and imagine a single clove. Small, dry, a bit knobby, no bigger than a fingernail. It doesn't look like much. But in the Middle Ages, that tiny fragment of plant was precious, so rare, so desired, so mysterious, that it could be traded like silver. It could finance journeys, spark wars, and shift the fate of kingdoms. This is not just a spice. This is a secret from distant lands, carried across deserts and oceans, passed from hand to hand, until it finally found its place on the plate of a medieval noble. The spice trade was one of the great engines of the medieval world, not because spices filled your stomach, but because they promised something greater: flavor, medicine, luxury, and control. In a time when most food was gray, boiled, bland, a pinch of cinnamon or a dusting of saffron was transformation. It could turn a peasant's porridge into something dreamlike. It could elevate a noble feast into legend. It made even spoiled meat seem fresh. And above all, it marked the table where it appeared as special, rare, powerful. But getting those spices to Europe was no easy feat. They came from places most Europeans had never seen: India, Sri Lanka, China, the spice islands of Indonesia, the coasts of Arabia, and North Africa. They were harvested by hand, packed into bundles, and loaded onto camels that crossed vast, sun-baked deserts, or onto ships that braved treacherous seas. These were long, dangerous routes filled with thieves, pirates, and unpredictable weather. Every mile traveled added to the price. By the time a handful of peppercorns reached a medieval port, they were more valuable than many people's monthly income. That meant only the rich could use them with any regularity. Nobles, clergy, and wealthy merchants sometimes kept their spices in locked boxes, literally tiny chests, with keys to protect their powdered treasures from theft. When used in cooking, the amount was measured not by taste, but by wealth. If you could afford to drown a stew in ginger, you did. If you could decorate pastries with clove and nutmeg, you did. Because the spices themselves spoke louder than the dishes they flavored. And yet, spices weren't just about flavor. They were magic, medicine, and mystery. Pepper was said to warm the body. Cinnamon cured colds. Nutmeg was believed to prevent the plague. These beliefs weren't just superstition. They were part of medieval medical theory. The body, people believed, was ruled by four humors: blood, black bile, and yellow bile in food could help balance them. Spices played a role in that system, guiding the body back into harmony. A good dish wasn't just tasty, it was therapeutic. But to the poor, spices remained a dream. Most peasants never tasted cinnamon or nutmeg. They knew them only as rumors, stories, something from far away. Their stews were seasoned with garlic, onion, and perhaps a bit of parsley or dill. Their bread was plain. Their ale was sour. A spicy dish was a sign not just of taste, but of distance between classes, between worlds. Markets occasionally offered substitutes crushed bark, dyed to look like cinnamon, ground seeds passed off as pepper. There were tricks, forgeries, clever deceptions. If someone offered you nutmeg for a low price, it was probably fake. But still, people bought it. The idea of spice was powerful enough to risk disappointment. Even a hint of that mysterious scent was enough to transport a dish and a person out of the everyday. And behind all of this was a network of trade that shaped empires. Venice grew rich taxing spices as they passed through its ports. Genoa built fleets to chase spice-laden ships. Arab traders protected their routes, guarded their sources, kept the origins secret. And as Europe's hunger for spice grew, so did its ambition. Portugal sent ships around the tip of Africa. Spain bankrolled Columbus not just for gold, but for a direct route to the Spice Islands. When that failed, they began taking land instead. Colonization, conquest, even slavery, all of it was fueled, in part, by the scent of cloves and the heat of pepper. And still, the spices came. Into noble kitchens, into monastery pantries, into the rituals of the church. Even the incense burned during mass frankincense. Myrrh was part of the same network. The same trade routes that brought cinnamon also brought silk, gems, ideas. Spices were not just food. They were threads in a vast web that connected continents, cultures, and histories. Even fasting wasn't free of spice. On church-mandated lean days, when meat and dairy were forbidden, nobles didn't suffer. Their cooks crafted rich stews from almond milk and lentils, seasoned with saffron and ginger. They made fish pies laced with cinnamon. They faked the richness of meat using only spice. Obedience to the church, but with flair. Yet spice also carried contradiction. It made bad food taste better, but it often masked spoilage. Why cover a roast in cloves? Because it was starting to turn. Why drown a stew in ginger? To hide something. Spices elevated meals, but also disguised their dangers. They were luxury and necessity, beauty and deception. Still, people craved them, fought for them, dreamed of them. And in doing so, they reshaped the world. A clove might pass from a farmer in Indonesia to a trader in the Arabian Gulf, to a ship captain bound for Venice, to a merchant in Paris, to the hands of a cook in a stone-walled manor house, and finally, to a dish that dazzled guests and whispered power. So tonight, as you stir sugar into tea, sprinkle cinnamon on toast, or grind pepper onto a soft egg, remember, these flavors once meant empire. They once meant danger. They once meant dreams. This was the spice root fragrant, fragile, fiercely fought over. A path paved not just with goods, but with hopes. Sleep well, because next time we face what happened when even spice couldn't save the meal, when famine arrived and hunger ruled the land. It doesn't begin with drama. No explosions, no grand proclamations. Just a quiet, persistent shift in the weather. A spring that arrives late, a summer that's too wet. The wheat doesn't rise the way it should. The barley comes in thin. The vegetables rot before they mature, and the animals grow nervous. It's subtle at first. A shorter market. A missing cart. A bread loaf smaller than last week. But in medieval Europe, that was all it took to summon a shadow that hovered behind every hearth famine. For most of us today, hunger is temporary, solvable with a walk to the fridge or a stop at a store. But in the Middle Ages, food was not guaranteed. It was seasonal, fragile, and deeply political. It came from the earth if the earth was kind, from the sky if the sky cooperated, and from trade if the roads were open and the merchants honest. But when those systems failed, hunger was not just a discomfort. It was a storm. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 didn't arrive all at once. It crept in with rain. Relentless, drowning rain that soaked the fields and turned soil into sludge. The crops rotted in the ground. Hay couldn't dry, so livestock starved. Even the grain stored for emergencies began to mold. Prices soared. A sack of wheat cost twice as much, then triple. Then there was none. In towns, the poor waited in long, desperate lines for bread that might never come. In villages, meals shrank to nothing. Dinner became boiled roots, nettle soup, a crust of bread from days before. And when even that was gone, people did what they could. They boiled bones for the marrow, then boiled them again just to flavor the water. They soaked leather shoes, scraping and chewing them like jerky. They gathered bark, dried it, ground it into a powder, and mixed it into flour. Dogs disappeared. Cats vanished. The birds grew wary. Rats grew bold. Whispers spread of graves disturbed, of children gone missing, of travelers never reaching their destinations. Most dismissed these as tales told in fear, but fear was everywhere. The church preached patience, penance, and prayer. The rich closed their gates and hired guards, and the poor endured. Or didn't. Hunger changes the body. It steals fat first, then muscle. It clouds the mind, weakens the heart, slows everything. Memory fades, vision dims, children stop growing, elders stop moving, and sleep doesn't come easily on an empty stomach. Families moved in search of food, abandoning homes, leaving behind fields, animals, and even graves. Villages that had stood for centuries went silent. A trail of footprints marked where survival was no longer possible. Foraging became not a supplement, but a way of life. Children wandered miles into forests, searching for mushrooms, berries, anything edible. But the line between food and poison is thin. Mistakes were common. Some families ate what they didn't recognize. The next morning, only silence. Desperation doesn't always wait for wisdom. Some people became surprisingly resourceful. Birds were trapped, insects gathered. Squirrels, crows, even worms became protein. Communities pooled what they had. Communal pots bubbled with everything from wild garlic to shoe leather. Rations were rotated, sacrifices made. Sometimes it helped. Other times it wasn't enough. A few nobles opened their granaries, trying to maintain order, stave off rebellion, or simply show mercy. Some monasteries gave out porridge, thin and bland, but life-saving. These were gestures not just of generosity, but of control. Feeding the hungry meant loyalty, or at least obedience. But famine didn't just kill bodies. It killed culture. Songs stopped. Celebrations vanished. Weddings were postponed. Births became rare. And even funerals became hasty affairs. No one wanted to sing when the stomach screamed. No one lit candles when there was no wax. People hoarded. Suspicion replaced trust. Generosity gave way to instinct. After the famine came disease. Malnutrition had weakened immune systems. Typhoid, dysentery, plague. These didn't just follow famine. They feasted on it. And yet, somehow, people survived. Not all, not most, but enough. Enough to rebuild, to remember, and to teach. The knowledge passed down was practical. Which root fields drained best? Which herbs held calories? How to dry food properly? When to preserve rather than eat? They learned to plant differently, to store differently, to fear different signs. In the years after the Great Famine, food rituals changed. Hunger had rewritten the recipe book of the poor, not with flavors, but with facts. The kind of facts you could stake your life on. So tonight, as you feel the quiet fullness in your body, As you move from one snack to the next, without a second thought, remember that for most of history, that was impossible. Hunger wasn't a metaphor. It was the weather. It was politics. It was a face across the table, asking if there was anything left. This was famine in the Middle Ages. Not a single event, but a recurring shadow. Brutal, bleak, and deeply human. But not unbeatable. Because in the end, the most extraordinary thing wasn't the suffering. It was the resilience. The fact that through the cold, the rain, the rot, and the ruin, people still cooked, still hoped, still waited for spring. Sleep well, because next time we arrive at something new, the slow, strange transformation of this hard, hungry world into something that almost begins to look familiar. Picture, if you will, the humble pottage, the thick, unremarkable stew that sustained families for centuries. It bubbled low over open fires, a blend of water, grains, vegetables, herbs, sometimes scraps of meat or bones. It was never about flavor. It was about filling bellies and lasting days. No recipes, no precise measurements, just a pot left to meld whatever was available. Yet, within that simplicity, an extraordinary transformation began. As medieval life grew more complex, so too did its cuisine. Trade brought rare ingredients, spices, preserved fruits, imported grains, and the boundaries between peasant fare and noble banquets began to blur. Pottage evolved. Small tweaks, lentils, onions, garlic added layers. A pinch of pepper here, a handful of beans there. Each family adapted it to local soil, local weather, local resources. Some pottages were thick enough to be eaten with a spoon. Others became the base for pies. Ingredients were chopped, stewed, stirred, then encased in pastry. Initially, the crust was inedible, a thick coffee meant only to hold the filling, but over time, people began to eat it and to shape it. Soon, pies appeared at tables, not just for survival, but for story. Meat pies, fish pies, fruit pies. Some packed birds within birds. When a pastry dome was cut, the flaps might release live chicks or birds. Decorative crusts took form: lattice, leaves, animals carved in dough. Pastry became sculpture. It was food and art. It was practicality transformed into performance. Cookbooks followed. Initially, they were handwritten, rare, and exclusive, passed among kitchens of the elite. They listed dozens of dishes, roasts, jellies, stews enriched with eggs or cream. They didn't give precise steps. They assumed you already knew how to cook. But that didn't stop them from inspiring. Over time, printed cookbooks emerged. Suddenly, dishes could travel beyond the noble household. Instructions still relied on touch and taste. Boil it well. Add spices, but the very presence of recipes signified change. Cooking was becoming knowledge to share, to teach, to memorize. In Northern Europe, grain diversity expanded. Wheat-based flatbreads and round loaves flourished alongside denser rye and barley breads. Pastries filled hand pies, tarts with cheese, or sweetened curd spread among village kitchens. Sweet and savory began to mingle. Honey, dried fruit, cheese, and meats layered behind modest pastries. Early ancestors. These dishes were portable, lasting, shareable. They were simple, but carried echoes of elite kitchens. Crusaders and merchants brought back ideas: rice, cooked with saffron, lemons used as souring agents, savory sauces rich with herbs. Monastic gardens grew new varieties, alongside medicinal herbs. Sauces thickened with cream and yolks appeared. Broths became clearer. Meat stocks improved. By the late Middle Ages, cooking was starting to resemble what we'd recognize today: deliberate, layered, flavorful. This transformation wasn't uniform. Each region, each village, each household made it their own. Italian cooks embraced pasta and cheese. French kitchens developed sauces. German cooks worked with vinegar and pickled flavors. English kitchens emphasized pies, roasts, and puddings. But across it all was the thread from pottage simple, adaptable, sustaining. Dish by dish, pot by pot, medieval food was being reborn. So tonight, as you slice into a savory pie or warm yourself with soup, remember, centuries ago, these were breakthroughs. The crust, once a container, became part of the meal. The cook, once anonymous, became author and artist. Recipes once rare manuscripts became printed tomes accessible beyond lords and bishops. Medieval cuisine didn't stay bleak forever. It learned. It changed. It encouraged flavors to evolve, techniques to spread, and meals to become experiences rather than necessities. Sleep well. You've crossed the turning point, from survival to creativity, from pottage to pie, from instinct to invention. Next time, we finish our journey by stepping into the moment when recipes turned permanent and cooking became art. Picture a medieval kitchen smoke swirling, pots simmering on the hearth, and a cook who never measures, only tastes. She knows the grain by feel, the stew by smell. Recipes aren't written. They live in her hands, passed through apprenticeship, whispered at her elbow over the pot. This kitchen knows no ink, no parchment. It knows intuition, memory, touch. And yet, change begins to stir. Across Europe, scribes and cooks begin to write. At first, recipes appear as notes in monastic scriptoria or noble houses in Latin or French, written by clerks for master chefs. They are not meant for peasant-use instruction manuals. Hardly. They are memory aids and markers of status. A titled cook might demonstrate a roast worthy of Richard II, a sweetmeat praised at court. These were recipes for power. One of the earliest known compilations, Fome of Curie, assembled around 1390 by Richard II's kitchen, lists more than 200 dishes from venison stews to almond milk soups without precise measures, assuming the cook knows her craft. Another, Leviandier, offers detailed descriptions of layered sauces and decorative pies, again meant for professional use, not common instruction. These manuscripts remained rare, exclusive treasures passed among the elite. But just as the printing press changed the world of books, it transformed cookery too. By the late 15th century, printed cookbooks began to emerge. In Germany, Kochbuchmeister brought recipes to a wider readership. In Italy, Bartolomeo Platina's De Honis de Voluptate combined cooking with health advice, guiding amateur cooks and linking food to well-being. These weren't charts of survival. They were guides to refinement, flavor, and care. Cookbooks changed what cooking could be. Instructions became more detailed. Boil until tender. Fry until golden brown. Bake until the crust cracks. They described timing, quantities, order of ingredients. They demystified cuisine. And as literacy spread, more people gained access: housewives, tavern keepers, merchant cooks. Knowledge wasn't confined to the manor. It spread across towns and villages, evolving with each translation, each adaptation to local ingredients. These written recipes carried more than technique. They carried culture. They taught which spices were fashionable, which methods were considered civilized, which dishes were appropriate for a feast, and which for a weekday supper. They recorded culinary trends, the shift from pottage to sauces, from communal pots to plated service, from instinct to intention. Yet even with inked recipes, cooking remained art. Measurements were often vague: a handful of flour, a goodly spoonful of sugar. Times were rough: a quarter of an hour over moderate heat. Cooks still relied on senses: sight, smell, taste, touch. But written words gave their craft permanence. A recipe could be copied, shared, preserved for generations. Think of the early printed cookbooks as heirlooms passed from one kitchen to another, annotated by cooks who scribbled notes in margins. Add more saffron here, fry longer, my father's turnip broth. These were dialogued texts, living records. They became communal memory, connecting people across regions and time. weaving a tapestry of medieval culinary wisdom. Over time, these guides evolved further. The 16th and 17th century publications grew more detailed recipes for cakes, pastas, confections, pies refined with sugar, butter, eggs. Doors opened to new world ingredients like tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate. But the roots were always medieval. Survival cooked into creativity, instinct shaped by experience, recipes born from need and elevated by intention. So tonight, if you follow a recipe book, measuring cups in hand, or watching a video tutorial, pause and appreciate how far it really goes. Our modern confidence in the kitchen-timed bakes. Exact ingredient springs from those first scribbles, that first recipe for roasted swan, that careful note on almond milk. Cooking became culture because someone decided to write it down. Sleep well. You've completed our slow journey through medieval food, from hunger and grit to creativity and memory, from pottage to printed parchment. And really, that parchment? It's the first kitchen mirror, reflecting not ingredients, but people curious, hopeful, always searching for flavor and connection. Thank you for sharing this long, warm exploration of history through food. I'd love to know, what dish or era would you like our next sleepy deep dive to explore?